first part of the song that I'm going to play first is the drop. It's the most exciting part of the song, and this is where the synth takes place, which is the most interesting part. So I'm going to go ahead and play that. So I'm going to go ahead and solo out the synth first and play that. So the synth is made of two different layers here. The first layer is this one. And the second one is this one. So the first one is really the synth that makes up this song, that Future Rave sound. It took me quite a while to figure out how to make this sound, and I was actually able to find it through a subscriber named, through a channel named Zen World. He has lots of great videos on there, and the big part of this actually is in the EQing. You can see here that I'm enabling that EQ. I'll go ahead and play this sound with the without the EQ and then with the EQ. So this is without the EQ. And now with the EQ. You can tell it adds more body to that sound, more fatness. Also some distortion and some compression on there. And the other sound is this. It's a basic saw wave, not much to it. For the processing for these sounds, for the main lead, I use a little bit more EQ, cut out the low end, some Camel Crusher to add some flavor there, boosting some of the low mid and high mids again, similar to what the EQ and the synth was doing, but it's just adding more, and then cutting out some more low end. For the support lead, there is more Camel Crusher, more EQ, increasing some of the low end there, adding some Fruity Blood overdrive, and some more EQing, and then kickstart to sidechain it. And then the lead bus is mainly where the reverb takes place. So most songs that I make, I don't really use this much decay and wetness, but for this Future Rave kind of airy sound, I thought this was one of the most important parts. I don't love using this much decay and wetness, but I think it was really important to this song. Once again, some more EQing, kickstart, and then a little bit of Valhalla supermassive delay. Here's what I use for the vocal part of the drop. So there's really not a whole lot to it. Some stereo shape to make it fill up that whole stereo spectrum. So it sounds like it's kind of floating. Typically with vocals, I don't add stereo shape to it, but because this isn't like a main vocal on like a pop song that you want in the middle of the stereo spectrum, I decided to add some stereo shape to this. Some EQ, cutting out some frequencies that I didn't like, cutting out the low end. For most EDM songs, I use drop chords. For this one, I did use drop chords, but I didn't really focus on them. So this is the drop chords right here. And this was simply to just fill in some frequency ranges that just weren't filling out. The drop chords consisted of 3 layers. For the processing for the drop chords, I pan one left and one right to once again fill out that stereo space more, which is just a really important concept for all of music that people need to definitely pay attention to. Cutting out the low end, cutting out the low end, cutting out some frequencies in one layer that I didn't like, cutting out the low end. And then for my bus, OTT compression, really glue those sounds together, cutting out the low end again. I like to cut out a lot of the high ends of my drop chords because the high end is for my lead. I mean, the lead is where I really want people to hear on that high end. So I take a little bit of a dip out on the drop chords. Some sound goodizer, add some more flavor to the sound, a little bit of distortion, and then cutting out some more frequencies that I didn't like. And then of course the sidechain. The drums in the first half of the drop is only a kick. And then in the second half of the drop, I add some more layers. The way your kick sounds is such an important part for all electronic music. In this instance, I put it in mono. Well, I actually always put it in mono, but I added the kick preset from Fruity Parametric EQ2. I really like the kick preset. A little bit of transient to make that punch through more. Cashmere Essentials kick, which is a great free plugin. I love just messing around with it and see what different sounds I can get. A little bit of Soundgoodizer. I would typically not use Soundgoodizer on a kick, but sometimes I like to just use a little bit of the A preset, but definitely don't go too crazy with it. And then some more EQ to cut out the very, very low end, which probably isn't even audible to the human ear anyways. The second half drop drums sound like this again. For the drop drums, the second half, I panned one ride right and one ride left, fill out that whole sound. That way everything's not just stuck right in the middle. And I like to use a drum bus for my drop drums, not my kick, but just the other supporting layers. The kick's a really important element that needs to be treated separately. So for the drum bus, he has a little bit of compression with TDR, which is a great free plugin. Some more EQ, cutting out the low end, and then cutting out some frequencies that I did. The last important layer of the drop is the bass. So it's a pretty short, punchy bass. I didn't really want a long, aggressive bass line that's gonna take up the whole sound. The whole point of this sound is that pluck noise. So I didn't want a heavy bass presence. The bass consists of 4 separate layers. The processing for each bass layer. Your basic sub bass. I have a saved mixer bus that I use for pretty much all of my sub bass, only including everything under 150, making sure everything under 100 is mono, using this great plugin that is currently not working because I just got a new laptop and I need to activate it, but it is a great free plugin that I would definitely recommend checking out. And then a little bit of saturation to add some more texture to that sound. And then kickstart with the sub bass sidechain. The second bass layer sounds like this. For all my other bass layers, I'm cutting out everything between 125, 150. That way there's room for the sub bass. Once again, a little bit of saturation, a little bit of Soundgoodizer. The next layer sounds like this. Cutting out the low end, cutting out a little bit of high end, and then cutting out some frequencies that I didn't like. This one is in mono. The reason why, you can listen to it while it's not in mono and just normal stereo separation versus mono. So the reason for that is when the bass is in a total, just normal stereo, it takes up too much of the stereo range that's going to interfere with the drop chords, the other elements, and I don't want that. I want the bass to not be one of the elements that's really standing out. And then this is the final bass layer. So that's really the meat of the sound there. Once again, just cutting out the low end, adding a little bit of saturation. For my bass bus, cutting out everything under 150 again, a little bit of compression to glue those sounds together, some saturation, a little bit of distortion. Usually don't go too crazy with distortion on my bass line, some people do. And then some kickstart, some sidechain. A very important part that people should be including in their drops and throughout a song is little ear candy things to make a song more interesting. You really don't even notice it when you're listening to the song as a listener, but it's such an important part that just helps, add more character to a song and move from one part to the next. And for this song, I use this. Once again, really small piece. It's just a snare and a clap, and it pans left to right with the white noise as well, just to fill in that space. So you can barely even hear it all together. And then I use the fill right here. I'm not going to talk too much about the effects within the drop. I think it's important to fill some white noise in your drop, but make sure it's at a really low level where it's not standing out. That's not what the focus of the drop should be on. Normally I start with an intro, but I started with a drop for this one, so now I'm going to go over the intro. So for the intro, I used the same synth, but the really cool part that I did here was I added the reverb so that there's a very high decay. There's already high decay, but a very higher decay and a very high wetness. I bounced it out and then I brought it back in and reversed it. And then I panned it left or right every time it hit and increased that volume as well. So it makes this kind of effect. I think this is a really cool part that really makes this intro more interesting. I didn't have this at first, but I added it in as a last minute thing, and I'm really glad I did. For the plucks in the beginning, it's the same as the drop. The only difference is that I added the mix level, an automation clip for the filter to add more transition from one part to the next, and then also the mix level of the delay to transition from the intro to the build. The drum elements, the bass, and the effects are a really important part of the intro. I'll go ahead and play those. So I have this 808 noise here with a crunching noise. Just some basic fill ambient noise. It's more ambience. Just to really fill up that sound. Even if the listener can't notice these things, it just makes the song sound better to fill it up. I'll go ahead and play the build. So here are the vocals solos.
This track will keep up the rave, so let's go.
So it's starting at I automated the channel pitch, and it's starting at a pretty low lower octave, and then it eventually comes back up to the normal pitch of the song, and the volume fades in as well. Same thing like in the intro. I have the plucks, but I add some automation to the pitch and to the filter mix level. Once again, just add more character. I would recommend one thing I've learned. I think Molfalk said in his YouTube channel, is that if you're not at 75 to 100 tracks for a song, I like to try and add more, and by adding more elements. And one way I can do this is just adding a simple automation clip for something like the filter or the mix level of the delay, moving from one part of the song to the next. It just adds more, makes it more easy on the ears transitioning. The other parts of the build are just a basic snare drum and then some other risers. I'll go ahead and solo those out together. I like to go over the bridge between the first drop and the second drop, because this is one of my favorite parts of the song. I'll go ahead and play this. Go ahead and fast forward for time. So the vocals are different than the ones that are in the intro. It is a loop that I found on Splice. For the processing for this, I pitched it down for a whole octave, removed the low end, add a little bit of sound getizer. Once again, the same compression that I used earlier, a little bit of reverb, and then cutting out some frequencies that I didn't like. The break plucks in the bridge are the same plucks that are in the intro and the drop, and they just move along based on the chord progression of the break chords and the break choir and the strings. So nothing too unique going on there. Now I'll go ahead and play the break chords and break choir together. This is one of my favorite parts of the song because I typically only stick to a not too complicated chord progression. I'm not too I don't know a lot about music theory, so for me this is really cool to kind of expand my knowledge just on a basic 4-bar chord progression. Instead, I decided to try and find ways to make it more uplifting. I did that by sustaining notes, diminishing notes, adding a 7th, and then also moving it up in the octave to add more tension. So the break chords consist of 3 layers. And all together. For the processing, I panned one of the break chords left, one of the chords right, fill up more stereo space, cutting out the low end, cutting out the low end again, cutting out some frequencies that were resonating. And then for the bus, some compression, some saturation, some reverb, and some stereo shape. I'm typically reaching for the same plugins in a lot of my different elements of songs, which I think is a good tool for people to really familiarize themselves with certain plugins. That way they can just pull it right in and know exactly what to adjust. The break wire only consists of 1 layer from contact. These are the same chords as the other break chords. For the processing, I cut out the low end, cut out some of the high end, cut out some frequencies, and then push some stereo width on it. The break bass line is just a basic sub bass and respace, and then the only drums that are in here is this element right here. It's a shaker loop clap and then another drum percussion loop that I found on Splice. The last part I'm going to go over is the second drop, which is pretty much the same as the first drop except for one different item. The difference here is the rising synth that I have. This rising synth is 2 layers. The first layer is this. Second layer is this. All I did is I made these 1 long sustained notes and I chopped them up based on the drums that were below it so that they were on the same pattern. For the processing for this, I panned one of the layers left, one of the layers right, and then bust them into this mixer channel where I removed the low end, added some distortion, some godizer. Once again, a lot of the same plugins that I use. One thing I really wanted to add here was fruity stereo shape, which is something that wasn't on the main pluck leads. The main point here, and with the panning, was that I was having a hard time getting this sound and the pluck leads to play together without interfering. Typically, whenever I don't deal with a lot of different synth melodies and layers overlapping each other in a drop, so this is very new to me. And the best way to do this is to think about the stereo field and how can you make room for each sound. And then the last difference of the second drop is the snare. And those are going to the same rhythm as the percussion. So all together, the second drop sounds like this. So I hope this video was helpful. First time I've done something like this, so go ahead and give me a comment based on what I can improve on or what you think was good or bad. Once again, the FLP is free and in the description. The song is also out now on Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, Apple Music, you name it. And I've got more music coming soon, so stay tuned.